We're looking at the impact of augmented reality in exhibition, and these are some of the points that I'll just cover briefly. Content. What does augmented reality distinctively offer as opposed to any other interpretation method? And how is it adding value to the cultural assets of the sites? And there's also issues in terms of recreating the past digitally, whether there are particular issues that users have in terms of their expectations of what museums should and shouldn't do, and the challenges that brings when there are gaps in the knowledge. Supplying devices. From the start we felt it was important that we did supply devices for people who didn't have their own iPads or devices with them. But there's issues of how do we secure them whilst giving freedom of movement. Also optimising the position of them in relationship to the objects and the environment to make it as easy for people to use as possible. And then how do we power them, how do we run a slave screen off them, and how do we bear in mind other users who either have their own devices or who don't want to use any devices at all and just enjoy looking at the objects.
This is a first prototype to be able to use the iPad, which this represents, in a more free position than a previous prototype. It needs to be kept secure and safe, and have to have a certain amount of movement restriction so that it can't be swung or abused. It's intended for use by the public in one of the galleries. So the logic was to suspend it by 3 wires which would restrict movement, and it would always return to a resting position which would be predetermined. It does have certain restrictions, so it will swing. So as this is the first prototype, I feel we need to try a second prototype which will have the retaining cables fixed to the sides. If that fails, we'll go to a third prototype. But first step is showing some promise. So we'll see how it goes. This is a new incarnation of the iPad mount to be used with the augmented reality triggers. It has greater manoeuvrability. The previous one was a little difficult to move about. This one has free movement in every orientation. To keep it secure and to keep it in place, came up with the idea of 3 hanging cables which restrict movement. It can be swung to a certain degree, but it's restricted so it can't cause too much damage, and you can't drop it on the floor. It's using a proprietary silicon cover at the moment, which will, if we go with using these, which they are very easy for people to handle and manipulate, we'll have to modify them for security purposes. So we'll have to do a bit more work to keep it secure, keep the cover secure, but keep the iPad secure as well. Power will have to come down, have to be tied to one of the cables, probably the one at the back, so it feeds in from the back. But we're also intending to use a separate slave screen which will be suspended above so that other visitors can see what is shown on the iPad screen. So there also needs to be, apart from a power cable, a separate audio-video cable, although it may well be one integrated cable. That's yet to be decided. The sound tube will be suspended above, so it will theoretically at the moment create a small pool of sound around the iPad so that it stops further sound pollution within the gallery, because there are 5 of these pods and we don't want them to compete with each other and also compete with the general ambient sound of visitors walking about and talking.
Sound. If you imagine 10 users in close proximity using their own devices in an exhibition, then obviously sound pollution is going to be a problem. So we're looking at ways where we can minimise that, and also we're looking at how we can add bass sounds in the exhibition that we may not get through the iPads or smaller devices.
This is an experimental audio device which uses a surface transducer, which is a bit like a loudspeaker without a cone, that fixes to a flat board that's suspended, which acts as a loudspeaker cone. It's then connected via an amplifier, an audio amplifier, to a small MP3 device that is the actual sound playback means. So on this, your little USB key, which is the storage means for the MP3 file, is the sound of birdsong, which is quite clear. If I then change it by putting in a different USB key with a different file, which has speech on it.
When I was a boy, I used to wander around museums with my father and found them fascinating places. So full
It's
and
more
rich,
distorted.
So many things to look at. And
At lower volumes it doesn't distort so much, but it's not really playing lower frequency sounds very well. So it seems to work well with high frequencies, but not so well with low frequencies. So for some ambient sound playback, it'll be fine. But for spoken word, I don't think we can use it.
in a funny way, it connects to the piece.
Instructions. From the focus group, it's clear that we need to help visitors make the journey when they step into this gallery of knowing what to do, and we're looking at providing video tutorials, graphic instructions, instructions of how people can download the app, how to use the devices, what they point their devices at, and any troubleshooting issues. Space. A major impact of providing augmented reality is the amount of space that people need around the marker objects to fully explore and to gather around as a social group. As part of the research and development of the project, we are exploring using objects as markers. We're also experimenting with a range of materials that will act as marker objects, such as lace, architectural models, textiles, paintings. We've realised that the orientation of the object is critical in terms of its relationship to the iPad and user, but also in the way it's displayed needs to align with the narrative that we're hoping to tell. We've realised that there's lots of choices that need to be made in terms of seeing a museum object alongside a digital layer, and we've decided to use 3 museum objects that will be partly seen along with the digital content. So it's October the 3rd, 2013, and we're working on the Riot 1831 at Nottingham Castle project. We are, as part of that, we are designing an exhibition around the needs of augmented reality. So we thought it'd be best just to do a mock-up. So this is what we're doing. We have a painting to represent the building on fire, and we also have an image of the fragment that was torn from the walls. The narrative that we're using at this part of the exhibition is from the viewpoint of a young girl named Mrs. Gilbert, and she remembers as a 2-year-old child being lifted up to a window, and she sees the castle burning, and she remembers the smell of the burning cedarwood around her. She also remembers looking down onto the street beneath the window and people selling the fragments of tapestries from the castle walls. So we've decided to mock this pod up. We thought it'd be the easiest way of working out. So this morning we measured the real painting, the distance between the iPad camera and the actual painting, and to get the top to the bottom of the image with the iPad camera was 53 centimetres, 530 mil. So we've replicated that with this frame, and we are trying to work out the best positioning really of the image to iPad that's come through for the user. And of course, we also need to work at different heights. So we have tall visitors, wheelchair users, short children. So we're just trying to grapple our way through the ideal positioning. We are hoping to have fixed iPads in the gallery for people who don't have their own iPads or smartphones, which is what this contraption is doing here. This is unusual, this pod, because we are trying to get visitors to move between two markers, the painting and the fragment of tapestry. So at the moment, we're sort of wondering about the possibility of moving between that one and then down beneath as she looks down from the window. We're experimenting with the idea of using real objects as markers for the digital content rather than as opposed to graphics. And the idea would be that the digital content would grow, the digital environment would grow around the actual museum objects. So for example, she remembers the sight of falling embers around her. And so as visitors would look around the gallery environment, we're hoping that we'd see falling embers overlaid the real environment. And also, as towards the end of the story, she sees rain fall. So again, the rain would fall in the real environment. And for this one, we'd see umbrellas of people on the streets beneath her and the hands that would come into shot, buying and selling the fragment beneath.
We've moved the painting forward, so it's now actually sloping slightly, although it could slope more. The reason for that being that with the painting flat, if you like, vertical, completely vertical, for me as a tall person, it meant that I had to have the iPad sort of more or less vertical, which meant it was quite low for me. It'd be ideal for smaller people or people in wheelchairs. And so we've decided to slope that, and I can see that reasonably well at the moment, although this stand is a little bit awkward and stiff to move around. But the problem is when you want to now look down onto the tapestry fragment, which we've got down there, represented down there, it's quite awkward to get that in the right place. And as you can see now, I'm leaning quite a long way forward, which you would think would be quite good for a tall person. I suppose I'd find it easier than somebody who was smaller to do it. But that's still forward from where I'm standing. I'm finding that I'm sort of slightly teetering forward to look at that. We've got the sloping painting, sloping slightly, but I think it might be possible to slope the tapestry as well, so that you didn't have to feel as if you had to get right over it, that you could then slope, you could sort of be back here and looking at that sort of angle, so you could really then move from something like that for the painting down to sort of that for the tapestry.
There's also some very practical visual qualities that need to be considered in terms of the lighting of the object, in terms of minimising the reflection behind the display that it's behind, such as the glass or the perspex. There's also the tonal qualities between the object and the display fabric, for instance, or the mount that it's displayed on. But there's also the tonal qualities within the object itself. So for instance, if there's a painting which with very little contrast, then that's more difficult for the augmentation to read it as a marker.
Now, one of the things we needed to bear in mind that the image has to be read by the device. So for a start, we've placed it on a dark grey fabric. This isn't the actual fabric we're going to use in the display, but it's a very close approximation in terms of colour. And so it gives us a good contrast between the light colour of the real object and the background. So we're hoping that that will aid with the way the device will read the object. We also have to make it easily read, and we're working at the moment on the assumption that a piece of the motif in the lace will be what is read, rather like we've got here, and therefore people have got to be able to read the motif without it being distorted, I guess is the best way of putting that. So we have to keep the ends of it, as we've got here, both ends essentially flat to aid with that reading.
Another thing that we have to consider differently to normal is that with the display of this, we're assuming that we're going to put it at this stage in some sort of acrylic box. Now, the problem with that is, and this goes for using paintings as well as markers, is the issue of reflection. There is a manufacturer of a non-reflective acrylic, and I don't suppose actually these will show, but the small piece in my left hand, this one here, is actually non-reflective, and it actually has a fairly, it's not totally scratch resistant, but it offers a pretty good resistance to scratching, which normal ordinary perspex doesn't do. There is scratch resistant perspex, but this one has the non-reflective and hardened surface which we're really looking for. So that's a product that we're looking at using at the moment for the manufacture of display cases. The last 3 points are interrelated, and we've got them as coherency, relationships and users. From the outset, we were very clear that we wanted to not do this as a digital add-on, so we are experimenting with a whole exhibition. The overall design, the overall narrative environment. We're looking at the relationships between the digital and the non-digital, so the normal bits of an exhibition that we usually deliver, such as the object, the graphic panels and the videos. Each element needs to be standalone and be valid and add value, but they also need to be mutually supportive of each other. And this can be more difficult than it seems to deliver.
Okay, I'm going to be doing the video and the graphic design work for the normal aspect of the exhibition. This needs to sit alongside and work well with the digital aspect, the augmented reality app. So hopefully we'll be using similar sort of visual language and aesthetic. And there's only so much you can fit onto the app as far as details are concerned, and hopefully the videos and a lot of the graphic work will embellish and add more stories and more dimensions to the overall story. All the different aspects of the exhibition need to work well together, but they also need to be able to stand on their own, so that visitors who may possibly not want to engage in the augmented reality app can still enjoy and get a full experience from the exhibition. Using video and graphics, we'll be able to present stories from lots of different people's perspectives. We've got, on the academic side, we've got Dr. Richard Gaunt from the University of Nottingham. He's going to be talking about the Duke of Newcastle and his diaries and his points of view.
It was here at the House of Lords in the early hours of Saturday the 8th of October 1831 that the Parliamentary Reform Bill was thrown out by the peers of the realm. Amongst those opposing the bill was the ultra-Tory 4th Duke of Newcastle, the owner of Nottingham Castle. The Reform Bill particularly threatened landowners like the Duke because of the influence that they traditionally enjoyed in parliamentary constituencies like Newark and Retford. At the time of the Reform Bill debates in the House of Lords, Newcastle was actually in London. He took part in those debates and spoke against the Reform Bill. Newcastle was first informed about the attack on the castle on the 11th of October 1831, and he records the event as follows. In conversation with Lord Melbourne, he told me that he had very bad news from Notts, that Nottingham was in a shocking state and that the rioters had set fire to Nottingham Castle.
In another video, Farah, a volunteer history student, talks about difficulties in doing historical research and how to interpret historical evidence taking into consideration such things as bias, memory over time.
Another part of the research process is being critical of your sources at all times. So when looking at Anne Gilbert particularly, her work was written when she was in her 80s, remembering back to when she was a child at the time of the riot. And that obviously causes a lot of problems with her source because much of her memory will be constructed after the event rather than what actually occurred at the time. She even mentions the fact that most of the things that she remembers from the night she was told later by her parents. Another problem with her as a source is that she is from an upper class family. She married someone who had lodged in the castle itself, and her attitude towards lower classes in society is reasonably dismissive, and she doesn't really show a particular understanding of anyone beneath her particular station. Also, you have to consider why she was writing the work. She was writing it at the time of the castle becoming a museum, so it was meant as a memorandum of the castle itself and its history. So she has a certain sense of glorification about the castle and its position in society at the time. So there's obviously quite a lot of problems with her as a source, but while considering that, you can't just dismiss her totally, because some of the things that she does say are significant. She does mention that there was a rising amount of wealth for the middle classes, which can be backed up by the fact that there were a lot of more expensive houses being built along the old medieval wall at the time. So while being critical, it's also important to remember that some of the things that people say you can't completely dismiss just because they have bias, because it must be remembered that everybody has bias in their own way. It doesn't matter what they're doing.
There are some other videos as well that we'll be doing as part of this exhibition. One will be with a guy from the fire service. He'll be talking about how they would have reacted and responded in 1831 to the events, and sort of giving a modern take on that. We've also another video with a guy called Mick Smurthwaite, who's the custodian, modern day custodian here at Nottingham Castle, looking at the role he plays and comparing that with James Marriott, who was the gatekeeper on the night in 1831. We'll also be filming a framework knitter who works locally, still uses traditional machinery. And also we're hoping to be talking to some young people who were involved in the rioting in Nottingham in 2011 and getting their perspective on things.
In terms of the impact on users, we're looking at the effects on empathy and whether the active discovery is more useful for them, whether the augmentation and the digital content leaves them wanting more information, and then how we provide that in the exhibition, and whether it adds to the understanding of the site history and the objects themselves.